PhD about transgender in UK in the 1990s, just as it was starting to emerge in this country. Then I wrote on the basis of that, which I'll talk about in a minute. The next big project was the Organisational Change and Resistance project, which included transgender, which was based around looking at local government and local governance in Northern Ireland, England and Wales, and what's been happening about all of the equalities legislation that came in under New Labour. And we did case studies in a number of different authorities, action research, interviews with councillors and with infrastructure organisations, including activist organisations. The next one that I'm actually working on at the moment is about bisexuality, because I've just become aware that there's a really big gap in the research and theorising around bisexuality, even though obviously we know that there are issues with the term bisexuality. And I've been doing interviews, and also one of my colleagues has been doing some work in Colombia, and we've got some work going on in India as well, which will feed into that project. And also just to say that I did do some research in India as well around gender and sexuality diversity, because I think that one of the things that's really important to consider is the international context. So in terms of what I've actually done, I'm aware that obviously things have moved on and are moving on in all sorts of really interesting ways around recognition, around IT, around community, around the plethora of identities. But just to tell you briefly what I've done, and some of you will know this work, in terms of conceptualising gender diversity, thinking about it in three different ways. The first is to expand male and female categories, so that we've got lots of different masculinities and femininities, including trans masculinities and femininities, in a way that starts then to disrupt rigid binary norms around gender. The second is to try to move beyond sex and gender completely, which people like Judith Lorber were talking about previously. Liminality, non-gendered, these types of identities fall into that approach. And then of course there's gender pluralism, where we think about gender as a spectrum, sexuality as a spectrum, and sex as a spectrum, and people being located at different points within this, not necessarily in a fixed way. And I think what we've seen since the 1990s is a shift in this direction, again with this plethora of identities, for example genderqueer, they fit quite well within that approach. Now when I started doing this research in the mid-1990s, people were saying, oh, we can't possibly think beyond these binary systems. Well, obviously some people did, like Ricky Ann Wilchins and Kate Bornstein, but a lot of people in this country are saying, oh, that's too difficult, it's politically too contentious. And actually what we've really seen over the past few years is a shift towards thinking in a much more open way about gender. Okay, jumping on quickly to look at citizenship approaches. The work that I've done around this I will discuss in a minute, but just to flag it up, quite different from some of the other more culturally based approaches that we've been talking about today. And as I said, I'm now working on bisexuality, and some of the contributors have identified as trans. So, in terms of what I'd like to do today, I'm not going to talk at you for 20 minutes, I'm going to break this down into little bits. So first of all, just very briefly looking at the history of categorisation. Now I know that you've talked about this in the last seminar, but there are reasons why I need to briefly revisit it. I'd like to look at queer. We'll stop then for a break and discuss issues around queer in our small groups. I'd like to look at post-colonial approaches. I don't have any kind of final answers on this, but I think it's important to start weaving it into our analysis now. And again, we'll stop and have a little bit of time to discuss that. And then I'm going to look at trans citizenship and materialism. And again, then we'll stop to discuss that in our small groups. And then I'll go back to conclude, and we can then feed back. You can ask me questions after that, and we can feed back from our small groups. Now, I'm hoping we're going to fit this all in time. So in terms of the history, now, let's not forget that these categories that we've got, these rigid male-female categories, lesbian, gay, bisexual categories, and transsexuality more recently, are fairly recent developments. And according to people like Miles Storr, the rigid categorisation of gender and sexuality emerged at around about the same time as rigid racial and national boundaries and categorisations, and they were all linked in with the colonial project of mapping and creating hierarchical systems with very important material implications, because obviously the people who were closest to the top of the hierarchy, the white men, the white heterosexual men, for example, who lived in dominant countries like England, would then be able to exert power and legitimise this over other groups. So as Hall says, capitalism demands specialisation and categorisation for its most efficient operation, and it's inextricably intertwined with patterns of social organisation beyond the realm of the strictly economic. So that's the organisation of labour, that's the reproduction of labour, that's in terms of policy and welfare, that's in terms of things like, you know, you've only got male and female categories on your passport. So I just wanted to flag that up before we get any further. Moving on to the much more recent development of queer and queer theory as a complete contrast. Now we know that queer is widely defined. It can mean deconstruction, it can mean fluidity, it can mean a resistance to heteronormativity, it can mean a number of different things. Now I'm not dismissing the term, it's useful for grassroots activism, particularly the origin of queer around AIDS activism and so on. It's useful for deconstructing rigid categories, and it's useful as an umbrella within which people who do not fit into normative categories can be and belong and explore things. So, for example, Lee, who is a trans man who contributed to the Bisexuality Project, says, I tend to identify as queer because it covers a lot more than just whether I'm attracted to men and women. It covers a lot more than which gender I'm attracted to. It covers a lot more about the rest of my sexuality as well. And I asked, can you say a bit more what you mean by queer? It's about the whole of my sexuality and lifestyle, not just my sexual orientation. It's about, well, I'm attracted to various people, various genders. We have a poly relationship, that's polyamory. So it's not just conventional marriage or conventional partnership and monogamous partnership. And I'm quite active within the trans community, and to a lesser extent the LGBT community as well. So what you can see here is that this person's using queer in a number of different ways, but as a way of validating identity, building community, and so on. And for that individual, it's a very useful term. But, as Plummer said way back in 1995, the newly emerging queer theory is an attempt to get beyond gendered and sexual practices of the social world, yet it continually harks back to those categories which it seeks to undo: male, female, straight, bisexual. Arguably, this is still relevant in some ways. I mean, you might disagree, you might think, well, we've moved beyond that, but it is difficult to escape these categories. And queer doesn't provide a one-way ticket outside the categories, because we still live in a social world that is very heavily structured. There are other issues which came up in the original research they did, and they are still coming up in the research I'm doing about bisexuality now. It's seen as vanguardist. There's an elitism around queer and who's the most queer. It's linked with certain sorts of youth cultures, popular cultures, which become less relevant after as people get older. There are lots of trans people who don't want to be queer, who just want to fit in to mainstream society with all the privilege that affords, or even just the survival that affords. And also, what was really interesting in this Bisexuality Project was there were quite a few people who said, well, the term is still really stigmatised. Queer is still really stigmatised. And I think outside of the urban kind of queer cultures that some of us do or don't inhabit, actually queer can still be seen as quite insulting. And particularly for people who are a bit older and they maybe grew up, you know, during the 1960s or 1950s, when it was used more as a term of abuse and stigmatisation. It can also erase diversity. So in the Bisexuality Project, what we found quite a lot was that queer tended in practice to end up meaning gay, male, and that specificities around bisexuality were being erased, but that could also perhaps be true of trans as well. I mean, maybe that's something we can discuss in the groups. So for example, this Andy, who's a cross-dresser, said, I must be queer as I'm not straight, but sometimes queer theory feels heady and quite extreme and I can't relate to it. So there's also an issue there about class and education, because if you've got the time and the energy and the intellectual capital in order to engage with queer theory and culture, then yes, you can start to make that yours. But this person doesn't, and so it can be quite alienating. So I'd like to pause there for a moment, and for us to consider how useful is queer theory in politics for understanding gender diversity in your field of academic work or your studies or your area of practice, because I'm aware that, or activism, because I'm aware that there are quite a lot of practitioners here and activists, and obviously we want to try to bridge all of these different lived realities that we have as individuals here today. I'm now going to look at post-colonial thoughts. Now, I suppose my experience of the trans community in the UK is there is a tendency for it to be quite white. And there's possibly an understatement. That's obviously not the case in some other countries, for example the US, Western countries. However, I think people like Katerina Rome have questioned this kind of, not just the whiteness of the trans community, but also the kind of ethnocentrism of some of the trans analysis that's taking place, and why that might be, and maybe starting to think about some alternatives. And I think really all I'm hoping to do now is just to raise this as an issue. I mean, we are living in an increasingly globalised world anyway. In terms of immigration and equalities within the UK, there's an immediate issue in terms of things like asylum seekers and refugees, people who've suffered gender-based violence in their countries of origin and have come here to seek sanctuary. But there's also a conceptual issue as well. Are we thinking about gender and sexuality in isolation? Are we thinking about the way in which our gender and sexuality are also ethnicised in particular ways? Are we thinking about, for those of us who are white, are we thinking about our whiteness critically? So as Blackwood said way back in 2000, from a Western viewpoint, sexuality constitutes an essential or core attribute of identity. Individuals are said to have fixed sexual identities or orientations. Sexuality is understood in the United States and Europe, however, often bears little resemblance to sexual relationships and practices across cultures. I think in terms of perspective, we need to remember that these systems of categorisation that we've got are relatively recent and Western constructs. There is a massive, massive issue around the framing of homophobia and possibly transphobia in allegiance with sort of southern-based nationalisms, and particularly around religion. So, for example, in some of the African countries, homosexuality being framed as a Western disease. I mean, the same may be happening with gender diversity, I'm not too sure. But basically, this is a post-colonial legacy that we need to deal with. There are also a number of countries where trans is being used in a political way. So I've spent quite a lot of time in South Africa working on other projects, and became aware of this organisation. This is a trans-focused activist organisation in South Africa. They're very dynamic, they're very active. They're the first African-based organisation solely focusing on the transgender community. And they provide trainings, they do activist organisation, they do outreach in the townships, and so on and so forth. There's a massive problem with gender-based violence in South Africa, towards trans people and lesbians and heterosexual women as well. And this kind of organisation is really, really important in starting to counter that. And they're having really interesting discussions. I mean, when I was over there was a lot of discussion about why intersex is being missed out in a lot of Western discussions about transgender, because over there they have a stronger intersex contingent or activist organisation than we do perhaps here. So I'd like now to talk about what's considering gender diversity in southern contexts mean for UK-based thinking and practice. So what I'm getting at here is, maybe we need to be thinking a bit more about diversity within this country, and how we can be more culturally sensitive to people who are non-white, those of us who are white. How does thinking about this difficult issue to do with the Western origins of the term trans, what does that mean in terms of being inclusive of southern contexts, in terms of referring to southern contexts? Does thinking about southern contexts actually shift us on here in the West? So it's those sorts of things that I'm asking you to think about. And also, those of us who are white, thinking about our whiteness, and if we're talking about marginalities and being marginalised, how are those of us who are white also privileged, and do we really own that? So if we'd like to spend another 5 minutes or so looking at that, that would be great. Thank you. There are lots of different ways of approaching trans citizenship. We can look at basic human rights, we can look at the right to safety, we can look at the right to freedom from hate crime, right to work and a family life, freedom from discrimination, and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is, across the world, trans people are being subject to hate crime and abuse. And I think those of us who have more cultural inclination, it's important not to forget that. And this is one of the problems I have with queer theory, that sometimes you can lose yourself in thinking about cultural forms and forget about material realities. We can have debates about the remit of citizenship. So this can be things like assimilationist radical issues. Do gender diverse people try to assimilate into the mainstream, or do people try to challenge it and change it? And of course it's not really a dichotomy, we can do both. But that fits within citizenship studies, that debate. We can have debates about how to actually achieve citizenship. So that could be through mainstream appeals to equal rights, which the mainstream trans community in the UK has quite successfully mobilised, in fact, through things like Press for Change in the 90s. We can think about participative democracy and mechanisms, which we discussed quite a lot in our project, the large ESRC one, the forums and the consultation mechanisms and so on, ways in which gender diverse people can actually get engaged in influencing policy making. That also fits within citizenship. And then there is this particularist universalist debate, which some of you may be familiar with. Do we focus on the interests and needs of small groups within groups, or larger groups, for example, the entire trans community, or specific groups within the trans community, or that is if there is a community, or do we focus on sexual and gender minorities, or do we in fact focus on everybody who may not be receiving the services that they require, which would be a very universalist approach. So that debate also fits within citizenship studies. So those are some of the debates that citizenship can bring to the table. It fits quite well with the materialist turn. As Sally Hines said in 2010, there's a move towards materiality within deconstructive approaches to gender and sexuality. While influenced by post-structuralist deconstructions of binary categorisations, such a framework maps the formations of power within and through gender and sexual categories. So basically it's not discounting the importance of post-structuralism and queer theory. It has enabled us to radically deconstruct categorisation systems that are rigid and that can be very discriminatory. But it's also saying, well, look, what's really important to us, it's about lived experience, it's about people having the right to participate fully in society, and again, it's about people being free of hate crime and discrimination. If we focus on context, we can start to get around some of the problems both with global inequalities, which I touched on in the discussion on post-colonialism, because if we look at specific context, within the UK, people's experience within maybe a small rural village will be very different from, if they're maybe in Manchester or Brighton. We were talking about this earlier in our small group. If we look at lived experience in context, we can start to map those differences effectively. We can also use it to address material realities and inequalities. So that's class, which is another thing that doesn't always get talked about very much in trans studies, I believe. Embodiment, so the limitations of embodiment. We're all going to grow old and at some point sadly pass away. There are limitations to how people can actually change themselves corporeally in terms of their gender performance. But there are also things like conflict and violence. So, for example, the experience of transgender people in conflict zones will be very different to the experience of people in parts of the UK on the whole. So we can start to look at these material things, these processes and structures. It also allows for the development of a social model of gender diversity, and for those of you who are working in mental health, this is very important. Because what we do there is we locate the inequalities that trans people and gender diverse people face outside of that individual. So that person is not pathologised, doesn't have something wrong with them per se, just by nature of being gender diverse. It is the system that messes people up, basically. That's rigid gender categories. That's the social inequalities that attach to those. And as I've said already, there's a contextualised approach which can be useful for developing nation-specific analysis. So, for example, I've got some material from Israel at the moment from a bisexual activist over there, Shiri Eisner, which deals very much with, you know, the police brutality and the conflict that's going on over there around gender and sexuality diversity. That's very specific to that particular country. It's got very specific historical and political trajectory. Important to take that into account. Right, it's correct that accepting gender diversity does produce a seismic shift in mainstream models of gender and sexuality, because we're moving away from a foundational approach rooted in male-female binaries, and that also disrupts LGB categories as well. And there are major consequences for our institutions. Only some of them have been really partially realised through things like the Gender Recognition Act. And there are elisions and erasions in UK-based discourses, especially around, I still think, intersex and gender fluid, androgynous and non-gendered and multiple gender positions. So the Gender Recognition Act, for example, doesn't really deal properly with people in those groups. And as I've already said, there's little discussion of race and ethnicity, and around other sorts of diversity it's also limited. And I think intersectionality is a really good route forward, but I've not really had time to talk about that today. So I'll finish this part of it now. There's a website, there are references. So questions?